The courtroom felt like a tomb. Not the peaceful kind where you find rest, but the suffocating kind where your heartbeat echoes so loud it drowns out everything else. My son sat beside me on the wooden bench, his 8-year-old legs dangling, too short to reach the floor. His face looked older than it should have, like he'd lived through years in the past few months. Damien, my ex-husband, straightened his tie and whispered something to his lawyer. That familiar smirk played at the corners of his mouth, the one that said he thought he'd already won. His eyes swept the room like he owned it. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Zaden. We were just obstacles to him now. Judge Callahan cleared his throat and shuffled through a stack of papers. When he finally looked up, his expression was serious but kind. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "you're requesting a modification of the current custody arrangement. You claim your son has expressed a desire to live with you permanently. Is this accurate?" Damien's confidence radiated across the room. "Yes, Your Honor. Zaden has told me repeatedly that he's uncomfortable with his current situation. He wants to come home with me where he belongs." My stomach dropped like I'd fallen off a cliff. I turned to look at Zaden, and what I saw made my chest tighten. His small hands were clenched together so tight his knuckles had gone white. He wasn't just nervous, he was terrified. I wanted to reach over and wrap him in my arms, to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't move. My whole body felt frozen in place. Judge Callahan's gaze shifted to Zaden and his voice softened. "Son, I need to ask you directly. Do you want to live with your father?" The air in the room seemed to disappear. My heart stopped beating, my lungs stopped working, my hope cracked right down the middle. I wanted to stand up and scream that this wasn't fair, that you don't put an 8-year-old on the spot like this in front of a room full of strangers while his father stares him down like a predator. But I stayed silent. I waited. Zaden stood up slowly. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his grey jacket and pulled out something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the old phone I'd given him months ago. The one he used for games and music. I'd forgotten it even still worked. Zaden looked directly at the judge, his voice quiet but crystal clear. "Your Honor, may I please play a recording from last night?" The entire courtroom went dead silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Damien's head snapped towards Zaden, his smirk vanishing in an instant. Judge Callahan leaned forward, his eyebrows raised. "A recording?" Zaden nodded, his grip tight on the phone. "Yes, sir. It's something my dad said to me last night." The bailiff stepped forward, but Judge Callahan motioned for him to wait. Before handing over the phone, Zaden added, "I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I recorded it, maybe someone would believe me." That's when it hit me. Something had happened. Something I hadn't seen, hadn't heard, hadn't been able to protect him from. And my little boy, my brave 8-year-old son, had found a way to protect himself. Every person in that courtroom was staring at Zaden, but he didn't back down. He stood with his shoulders squared, his small fingers wrapped around that phone like it was his lifeline. Damien's confidence had completely evaporated. Judge Callahan hadn't even pressed play yet, but the tension was already unbearable. "Are you certain you want the court to hear this recording?" the judge asked gently. Zaden nodded without hesitation. My throat felt like sandpaper, my hands balled into fists in my lap. Whatever was on that phone, whatever Damien had said to my son, Zaden was brave enough to expose it here in front of everyone, including his father. I stared at him, really looked at him, and something inside me shattered and rebuilt itself at the same time. He wasn't just scared anymore. He was fighting back. He was standing up for himself, for me, for what was right. Judge Callahan finally pressed play, and in that moment, everything changed forever. People ask me all the time why I stayed with Damien as long as I did. The truth is, I don't have a simple answer for them. Love doesn't follow a straight path. Sometimes it's like getting caught in quicksand, sinking so slowly you don't realize you're drowning until you can't breathe. I was 22 when we met. Damien was everything I thought I wanted: confident, charismatic, the kind of man who could walk into any room and command attention. He made me feel special, like I was the only person in the world who mattered to him. What I didn't understand then was that some people make you feel seen just so they can figure out exactly where to hurt you. The control crept in gradually. First, he didn't like certain friends of mine. He called them toxic influences and said they were holding me back. Then he wanted me home more often. He told me that real women put their families first, that going out all the time made me look desperate for attention. When I got pregnant with Zaden, everything accelerated. I quit my job at the library. Damien insisted he could provide for all of us, but his support came with strings attached to my freedom, my voice, my sense of self. By the time Zaden turned 3, I barely recognized the woman I'd become. I couldn't have my own debit card because Damien said I was irresponsible with money. I couldn't drive anywhere without telling him exactly where I was going and when I'd be back. If I put on makeup, he'd ask who I was trying to impress. If I didn't, he'd tell me I looked like I'd given up on myself. Nothing I did was ever right. The breaking point came when Zaden was 5. He accidentally knocked over his juice cup, and it spilled across our living room carpet. Damien exploded. He towered over our little boy, screaming so loud the neighbors probably heard him 3 houses down. I stepped between them, my whole body shaking, and said, "Don't you dare yell at him like that." Damien turned on me with that look I'd seen too many times, the one that made my blood turn to ice. That night, while he was asleep, I packed a single backpack, scooped up Zaden and walked out the door. We stayed with my mother, Evelyn, for 2 weeks until I found a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. I got my job back at the library during the day and took on cleaning office buildings at night. The schedule was brutal. Some nights I only got 3 hours of sleep, but I was free. And most importantly, Zaden was safe. My mom became our guardian angel. She watched Zaden while I worked double shifts, helped him with his homework, and made sure he had hot meals every day. She'd stayed quiet during my marriage to Damien, but after we left, she finally spoke her mind. "I wanted so badly to say something," she told me, "but I knew you had to figure it out on your own. I prayed every single night that you'd find the strength to leave before things got even worse." For the first 2 years after our separation, Damien seemed almost relieved. He'd pick up Zaden every other weekend and act like he was doing me some huge favor. But 6 months ago, something shifted. He showed up at my door wearing an expensive new suit, accompanied by a lawyer I couldn't afford to hire. He announced that he wanted full custody of Zaden. He claimed I was mentally unstable and that our son had told him he wanted to live with his father instead of me. It felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I knew it was a lie. Zaden loved our life together. We had our routines, bedtime stories every night, Saturday morning pancakes with extra syrup, soccer practice after school. He'd never once mentioned wanting to live with Damien. But I also knew how persuasive Damien could be when he set his mind to something. He'd always been 2 different people, the charming man everyone else saw, and the controlling monster I'd lived with behind closed doors. The weeks before the hearing felt like walking through a minefield. Zaden started having nightmares and would crawl into bed with me in the middle of the night. He asked strange questions about judges and courtrooms. One evening, as I was tucking him in, he whispered, "What happens if someone tells lies and people believe them instead of the truth?" I turned to face him and gently stroked his hair. "Then we make sure we tell the truth louder and clearer," I said. "That's what brave people do, even when it's scary." He nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I didn't know it then, but he was already carrying the weight of whatever Damien had said to him. He was already preparing to be braver than any 8-year-old should have to be. The morning of the court date, he put on the grey jacket that Evelyn had carefully ironed the night before. He asked if he could bring the old phone I'd given him for games. I said yes without thinking much about it. He'd been using it to listen to music and play simple games to calm himself down. I never could have imagined that phone would become the key to our entire future. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to Damien's lies fill the air while the judge studied us like he was weighing our lives on a scale, I found myself praying. Not for the court to believe me, not even for justice. I prayed for my son to feel safe enough to speak his truth. And somehow, even at just 8 years old, he did more than speak it. He proved it. The day Damien's lawyer served me with the custody papers, I barely made it to the kitchen sink before I threw up. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold onto the counter. Zaden was at school, giving me 4 hours to pull myself together before pickup time. 4 hours to figure out how I was going to survive another battle with the man I'd barely escaped from. I called my mom immediately. She arrived within 30 minutes carrying a thermos of chamomile tea and an old manila folder stuffed with legal documents from her own divorce years earlier. She sat me down at my tiny kitchen table, took my hands in hers and said, "This is going to be the fight of your life, but you're not going to lose. You have something he doesn't, the truth, and you have Zaden. Zaden." That's exactly what terrified me most. He was only 8 years old. He didn't understand legal proceedings or custody battles. He just wanted to play soccer with his friends and eat chocolate chip waffles on Saturday mornings. I hated the idea of dragging him through this nightmare, but I didn't have any other choice. At first, Damien played his cards carefully. When he came to pick up Zaden for his court-ordered weekend visits, he'd arrive wearing brand new clothes and carrying expensive toys I could never afford on my library salary. He'd smile at me like we were old friends, tell me he only wanted what was best for our son, then lean in close when Zaden wasn't looking and whisper, "You honestly think any judge is going to give custody to someone working part-time jobs and living in a shoebox?" I never responded to his taunts. I'd close the door and sit on my couch for hours, staring at the front door and wondering if it would open again. But it always did. Zaden would come back quieter each time. He'd go straight to his room without saying much about his weekend. As the weeks passed, the silence grew heavier. He stopped telling me about the things he and Damien did together. He'd flinch whenever I asked how his visits went. One night, I heard him crying into his pillow. I sat on the edge of his bed and asked what was wrong. "Is it bad if you don't want to live with someone, even if they're your dad?" My heart stopped. "No, sweetheart," I said carefully. "It's never bad to want to feel safe and loved." He rolled over to look at me, his eyes filled with worry. What if he gets really mad if I tell people that? I wanted to promise him that everything would be okay, that the judge would listen to him, that he didn't need to be afraid. But I couldn't lie to him. Instead, I held his small hand and said, "No matter what happens, I will never, ever stop fighting for you." 2 weeks before the hearing, Zaden started asking detailed questions about the court process. What did judges actually do? Who was allowed to talk? Would he have to speak in front of everyone? I explained everything as gently as possible, telling him the judge just wanted to understand what would be best for him. He nodded like he understood, but I could see the fear growing in his eyes. Then came the final weekend visit before our court date. Damien arrived in his SUV almost an hour early, like he was trying to catch us off guard. Zaden didn't want to go. He wrapped his arms around my waist and said his stomach hurt. I almost kept him home, but Damien stood on my porch with his arms crossed, staring at me like he was daring me to refuse. Zaden walked to the car like he was walking to his execution. I watched from my living room window, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Damien leaned down until his face was inches from Zaden's, and he spoke to him in a low, urgent tone. Zaden didn't say a word back. He just got into the car with his shoulders hunched. When he returned Sunday night, he was a different child. He was too quiet, too withdrawn, too calm for an 8-year-old who should have been excited about his weekend. He didn't eat the dinner I'd made for him. He just sat on the living room floor playing with that old phone I'd given him. When I asked if everything was okay, he nodded and said he was tired, then went to bed without our usual bedtime story. That was the night before court. I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what Damien had said to him, wondering if my ex-husband had threatened our son. I had no proof, just a sick feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. The next morning, Zaden put on his jacket and asked for the phone again. When I asked why he needed it, he just shrugged and said, "I might want to listen to music to stay calm." We drove to the courthouse in complete silence. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tight. Zaden sat in the back seat, staring out the window like he was memorizing the view. When I looked at him in the rearview mirror, his face was blank, but his fingers were wrapped around that phone like his life depended on it. When we entered the courtroom, Damien was already there with his lawyer, looking confident and relaxed. He turned to smile at me like we were meeting for coffee instead of fighting for our son's future. My stomach churned. Judge Callahan entered. The bailiff called the room to order. Papers rustled. Lawyers whispered to each other. And then Damien stood up and dropped his bombshell. "Your Honor, Zaden has told me multiple times that he wants to live with me. He's expressed that he doesn't feel safe living with his mother." I stopped breathing. My hands clenched into fists in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. I couldn't bring myself to look at Zaden. Then Judge Callahan turned to my son and asked, "Is what your father said true?" Zaden stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out that old phone and held it up for everyone to see. "Your Honor, may I please play a recording from last night?" Judge Callahan stared at Zaden, clearly caught off guard by the request. He lowered his reading glasses and tilted his head slightly. "What kind of recording are we talking about, son?" Zaden's voice didn't waver, even though it was barely above a whisper. "It's from last night, sir. My dad said something to me, and I wasn't sure anyone would believe me if I just told them, so I recorded it on this phone. The entire courtroom went silent. Even Damien stopped whispering with his lawyer. He was staring at the phone like it had just betrayed every secret he'd ever kept. Judge Callahan gave a brief nod. "Please bring the phone up here." Zaden walked across the courtroom floor, his sneakers making soft sounds that echoed off the walls. He placed the phone carefully on the judge's desk, then returned to sit beside me. His shoulders were tense, his eyes focused on the floor. I reached over and covered his hand with mine. He didn't look up, but he squeezed my fingers tight. Judge Callahan pressed play. Static filled the room first. Then Damien's voice cut through the silence, cold and threatening. "If you don't tell them you want to live with me, I swear I'll make sure your mother disappears forever. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" Zaden's small voice followed, shaky but clear. "But I want to stay with Mommy." Damien's response was sharp and cruel. "That's not up to you. You're just a kid. You'll say exactly what I told you to say, or things are going to get much worse for her." The courtroom felt like it was spinning. Someone in the gallery gasped audibly. Damien's lawyer turned to stare at him with wide, horrified eyes. Damien's face went completely rigid, his mouth hanging open like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at me, then at Zaden, then down at his hands. Judge Callahan didn't move a muscle. He played the entire recording again from beginning to end. Nobody spoke. When it finished, he removed his glasses and folded his hands on his desk. "Mr. Carter, is that your voice on this recording?" Damien opened and closed his mouth several times before any sound came out. Finally, he managed to stammer, It sounds like my voice, but I think there might be some kind of mistake. Did you threaten your son last night?" Judge Callahan interrupted, his tone much firmer now. Damien glanced desperately at his lawyer, who leaned over to whisper something urgent in his ear. But Judge Callahan wasn't waiting for their conference. He turned to me instead. "Ms. Ray, has your son expressed concerns about his safety or yours during previous visits with his father?" I nodded, my voice barely steady. "Yes, Your Honor. He's been having nightmares for weeks. He stopped eating properly after visits. He asked me if people would believe the truth if someone was lying about them." I looked down at Zaden. His small fingers were still gripping mine like an anchor. He sat up a little straighter, like he was finding strength he didn't know he had. Judge Callahan addressed the entire courtroom. "I need some time to process what we've just heard. Court will recess for 15 minutes. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made everyone jump. People started standing and moving around. Lawyers huddled together in urgent conversations. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of water. I stared at my son, still in shock. "You actually recorded that?" I whispered. He nodded solemnly. "I didn't think they'd believe me if I just said it. But I thought maybe they'd believe his own voice." His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. I pulled him into my arms and held him as tightly as I could without making a scene in the courtroom. Across the room, Damien sat staring straight ahead at nothing. His lawyer was already packing up files and folders. Whatever confidence he'd walked in with had completely drained from his face. Evelyn approached us from where she'd been sitting in the gallery. She'd been silent through the entire hearing, but now she knelt down beside us and whispered, "You raised an incredibly brave boy, Marley." I nodded, still trying to process everything that had just happened. I'd walked into this courtroom terrified that I was about to lose my son forever. Instead, my 8-year-old child had just done something I never could have imagined. He'd told the truth when it mattered most, and he'd proved it in a way that nobody could deny. What we'd just heard wasn't just a child's testimony. It was evidence. It was courage in its purest form. When court resumed, I still didn't know what Judge Callahan would decide, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Zaden had made his choice. He'd taken action. And in doing so, he'd shifted the balance of power in that room in a way that even Damien couldn't manipulate or control. We hadn't won our case yet, but everything had already changed because of what my son had done. When Judge Callahan returned from recess, the courtroom fell silent again. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, still feeling the warmth from Zaden's small fingers. He leaned against my side, exhausted but peaceful, like he'd already accomplished the hardest thing he'd ever have to do in his life. Judge Callahan settled into his chair and looked across the room with a gravity that hadn't been there before. He glanced at the bailiff, then at both attorneys, and finally fixed his gaze on Damien. "I have listened to that recording multiple times now," he said slowly. "There is absolutely no question in my mind about its authenticity. Mr. Carter, your voice, your words, and your intentions were crystal clear." Damien shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes darted to his lawyer, who sat frozen beside him. "You threatened a child in an attempt to manipulate the outcome of these proceedings," Judge Callahan continued. "You tried to coerce your son into lying to this court about his own wishes and feelings. This behavior is not only deeply disturbing, it represents a fundamental violation of every ethical standard we expect from any parent, let alone one seeking custody." Damien started to open his mouth, but Judge Callahan held up a hand to stop him. "You will not speak in this courtroom again unless I specifically ask you a direct question. Do you understand me?" Damien nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched tight. Judge Callahan's voice softened as he turned to Zaden. "Young man, what you did here today required tremendous courage. Courtrooms can be intimidating places for adults, let alone for someone your age. But you chose to tell the truth, and you helped this court understand what was really happening in your life. I want you to know that I heard every word you shared with us." Zaden didn't respond verbally. He simply nodded once, his eyes wide with understanding. I squeezed his hand again, and he held on tight. Judge Callahan turned his attention back to the attorneys. "Based on the evidence presented today, I am categorically denying Mr. Carter's petition for custody modification. Furthermore, effective immediately, all visitation rights are suspended pending a comprehensive review. Before any future contact with the minor child will be considered, Mr. Carter must complete both a psychological evaluation and a court-approved parenting education program. Any future visits, should they be deemed appropriate, will be strictly supervised." Damien let out a sharp breath and slumped back in his chair. All the colour had drained from his face. Judge Callahan continued, addressing my attorney directly. "Ms. Ray has clearly provided a stable, nurturing environment for her son. In light of today's revelations, I see no reason whatsoever to disrupt the child's current living situation. Full legal and physical custody will remain with the mother. This ruling is final pending any future court review, and any contact between Mr. Carter and the minor child will be entirely at the discretion of this court." I felt my chest expand with a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. This wasn't just relief flooding through me. It was justice. For the first time in years, someone had seen through Damien's manipulation without me having to exhaust myself trying to prove what I knew to be true. And the person who had made that possible was sitting right beside me, still holding my hand. Judge Callahan stood and raised his gavel. "This court is now adjourned." People began moving around the courtroom. Lawyers started packing their briefcases. The bailiff stepped forward to handle procedural matters. But I couldn't move. I turned to face Zaden and gently cupped his face in my hands. "You were so incredibly brave today," I whispered. "I'm proud of you. You didn't have to do what you did, but you chose to anyway." He looked up at me, his eyes shining with emotions he hadn't let himself feel yet. "I just wanted everyone to know the truth," he said simply. "I didn't want anything bad to happen to you." My heart broke apart and put itself back together in the same instant. I pulled him into my arms and held him there, surrounded by the sterile walls of the courthouse and the weight of everything we'd carried to reach this moment. Damien walked past us on his way out, his expression completely blank. He didn't say a word to either of us. Zaden didn't even look in his direction. He didn't need to. Evelyn met us in the hallway outside the courtroom. She opened her arms wide and Zaden ran straight to her. She wrapped him in a hug so full of love and pride that I thought it might lift all three of us right off the ground. We walked out of the courthouse together into the bright afternoon sunlight. As we stepped onto the sidewalk, Zaden looked up at me and I saw my little boy again, the one who giggled at cartoons, begged for extra syrup on his pancakes, and made up silly songs about our cat. The fear that had been living in his eyes for months was finally gone. That was the day everything changed forever. Not because the court ruled in my favor, but because my son found his voice and chose to use it when it mattered most. The drive home was peaceful and quiet. Zaden sat in his booster seat in the back, gazing out the window with his seatbelt snug across his chest. I checked on him in the rearview mirror every few minutes, just to make sure he was really okay. He didn't say much during the ride, but he wasn't scared anymore. His shoulders were relaxed, his small hands resting calmly in his lap. That was all I needed to see. When we pulled into our driveway, Evelyn had already arrived and was waiting for us with a pot of homemade chicken soup warming on the stove. She didn't say anything when we walked through the front door. She just hugged us both tight, kissed Zaden's forehead, and handed me a steaming bowl like it was her quiet way of saying, "You're safe now and you're home. Later that evening, I tucked Zaden into bed in his cozy room filled with his favorite books, stuffed animals, and the old superhero blanket he refused to give up, even though it was frayed at the edges. He settled under the covers and looked up at me with those serious 8-year-old eyes. "Am I going to get in trouble for what I did?" he asked quietly. "No, baby," I said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "You're not in trouble at all. You told the truth, and telling the truth is never wrong." He was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "Do you think Daddy will be mad at me?" I didn't rush to answer. I looked at his face, still so young but somehow aged by experiences no child should have to carry. I gently brushed his hair back from his forehead and said, "He might be upset, but what he did was wrong. What you did was right and brave. And someone being angry at the truth doesn't make the truth any less true." He nodded slowly and rolled onto his side. I sat with him until his breathing became deep and steady. I watched his chest rise and fall in the peaceful rhythm of sleep. I wanted to memorize that moment forever. After everything we'd been through together, my son could finally rest without fear. In the weeks that followed, Damien made a few attempts to contact us. His lawyer called twice, but both times I simply referred them to the court order and hung up. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The paralyzing fear had been replaced with something much stronger: resolve and peace. Zaden started smiling again, really smiling. He asked if he could ride his bike around the neighborhood again. He requested Saturday morning waffles with extra whipped cream and got caught sneaking spoonfuls from the container when he thought I wasn't looking. He talked excitedly about school, about his best friend Jake's ridiculous new haircut, about how he thought he might want to be an astronaut when he grew up, or maybe a video game designer. His laughter returned too, that deep belly laugh that had been missing for so many months. One evening while we were washing dishes together, he said out of nowhere, "I think I might want to be a lawyer someday." I smiled and laughed. "You'd make an excellent lawyer." He grinned back at me. "They listen to people who tell the truth, right?" I put down the dish towel and pulled him close to me. "Yes, and the very best lawyers protect people who need someone to hear their voice." That night, after Zaden was asleep, I sat on our couch with a journal I hadn't opened in years. I turned to a fresh page and wrote, "My son saved both of us today." Not with anger or revenge, but with simple, honest truth. He'd reminded me that real courage doesn't always announce itself with shouting. Sometimes it's a small, clear voice saying exactly what needs to be said at precisely the right moment. Zaden hadn't just helped the court see the truth about his father. He'd helped me see myself again strong, capable, whole, resilient. I had survived the storm, but he had walked through it right beside me. And in the end, he was the one who chose to stand up and speak. People talk constantly about protecting children, but sometimes children are the ones who protect us. Sometimes they show us what it truly means to stand tall, to face down fear, to hold your ground when every instinct tells you to run and hide. I will never forget the expression on his face in that courtroom. I will never forget the sound of his voice asking, "Your Honor, may I please play a recording from last night?" And I will never forget how the entire world shifted in that moment because of his courage.